Imagine a country where, 40 years ago, more than 80% of the population lived below the extreme poverty line. A country where an ordinary bicycle was considered a luxury that people saved up for years to buy, and meat was served only on major holidays. In 1978, China's economy was smaller than that of the Netherlands, even though it had 60 times the population. It was a giant pressure cooker, boiling over with despair. The world viewed China as a hopeless case, but it was precisely at that moment, in the silence of closed offices and the fear of village huts, that a transformation began, which would later be called the most successful economic experiment in history. This is the story of how ideology was traded for food and fear for prosperity. In 1976, Mao Zedong died. This man of an era left behind a country that knew how to march but had forgotten how to build. China stood at a crossroads: continue building a rigid communist system and starve, or risk everything. Deng Xiaoping entered the scene, a man just 150 centimeters tall who had been ousted from power 3 times and returned 3 times. He was no theorist. He was a pragmatist. He coined the phrase that transformed the minds of 1 billion people. It doesn't matter what color the cat is, black or white. The main thing is that it catches mice. This was a signal. It no longer matters to the state whether you believe in Marx. What matters to the state is that you start making money. Do you think the reforms began in the ministries? No. They began with a crime in the remote village of Shaogang, winter 1978. 18 local farmers, driven to the brink of starvation, gathered in a dilapidated hut. They decided to take a deadly risk, to secretly divide the communal land among themselves. In those days, this was called capitalism and was punishable by execution. They signed a secret blood pact. The idea was simple. We'd give the state its required quota and keep and sell whatever we grew beyond that. They agreed. If any of them were arrested or executed, the others were obligated to raise his children until they turned 18. The result? In a single year, this village produced more grain than in the previous 20 years combined. Deng Xiaoping found out about this, and instead of executing the rebels, he said, "Let all of China do the same." Deng understood that agriculture was only the beginning. Technology was needed, but how could he lure the damned capitalists from the US and Europe into communist China? In 1980, he took an unprecedented step: the creation of special economic zones, SEZs. Shenzhen was the first. At the time, it was a dusty village of 30,000 people, where fishing was the only source of income. China told the world, "Come to us. We'll give you land almost for free. We'll give you millions of workers willing to work for pennies, and we won't tax you." Western businessmen initially scoffed, but then they crunched the numbers. Hong Kong businessmen were the first to arrive, followed by the Japanese and then Apple, Nike, and the rest of the world. Shenzhen became a testing ground. If an experiment succeeded there, it was scaled up nationwide. If it failed, it was simply shut down. The main problem wasn't the economy, but people's mindsets. For decades, people had been taught that private property was evil. Deng Xiaoping launched a cultural revolution in reverse. He introduced a new slogan to the masses: "Getting rich is great." This was the green light for millions of entrepreneurs. The era of township and village enterprises began, small workshops in garages and basements. It was from these basements that giants like Lenovo and Haier would later emerge. The Chinese began working like mad. They weren't just building factories, they were building a new life. By the late 1980s, China was unrecognizable. GDP was growing at a rate of 10% per year. People tasted Coca-Cola for the first time, started wearing jeans, and saw foreigners. But this rapid growth created new problems: inflation, corruption, and social inequality. The old system was beginning to fall apart at the seams. Ahead lay 1989, the year that could have brought everything to a halt. The year of tanks in Tiananmen Square, and the year the world decided the Chinese miracle was over, but they persevered. And in the next chapter, we'll explore how China transformed from a student into the world's factory, flooding every home on the planet with its goods. If you grew up in the 90s or 2000s, the phrase "made in China" probably made you smirk. Counterfeit sneakers with 4 stripes, toys that broke on the very first day, and toxic plastic. The global economy had cast China in the role of a powerless laborer. Leading brands were certain this billion-strong population would forever sew cheap clothes for them for pennies. But in reality, the largest economic operation in history was unfolding at that very moment. While multinational corporations rejoiced in super profits from cheap labor, Beijing was step by step implementing a plan to seize global technological leadership. How did China manage to transform its reputation as the world's dumping ground into the status of the planet's main production hub, without which every business in the US or Europe would grind to a halt tomorrow? Let's take a look behind the scenes of this era. In the early 1990s, the Chinese government took an unprecedented step. It authorized controlled internal migration. This triggered a seismic shift. More than 200 million peasants from impoverished provinces simultaneously moved toward the coast. It wasn't just factories that began appearing on the map, but entire factory towns. The most striking example is Foxconn's campuses, where most of Apple's devices are assembled today. Imagine a gated city where up to 500,000 people live, study, and work behind a fence. It has its own fire stations, its own hospitals, gigantic cafeterias where tons of rice are cooked daily, and dormitories where people slept in shifts. For Western businesses, this was a financial paradise. Why pay a worker in Germany or the US with their unions and insurance when millions of young people in China are willing to work 12 to 14 hours a day? But there was a flip side to this coin that Western executives preferred not to think about. Beijing understood that if it simply continued to manufacture other companies' products, the country would remain poor. It needed technology. But how could it get a company like Volkswagen or General Motors to hand over the blueprints for its engines? The iconic rule of joint ventures came to the rescue. China issued an ultimatum. Do you want access to our market, home to hundreds of millions of potential customers? Great. But you have no right to own a factory in China on your own. You must establish a joint venture with a local Chinese state-owned enterprise, and your stake cannot exceed 50%. Western giants, blinded by greed and potential profits, agreed. They brought state-of-the-art equipment to China themselves, trained Chinese engineers themselves, and demonstrated how supply chains work themselves. It was a legal, documented transfer of expertise unlike anything the world had ever seen. As soon as Chinese experts grasped the logic of production, a phenomenon known in China as Shanzhai took hold. Originally, the word was translated as mountain bandit fortress, but in the 1990s, it came to represent a philosophy of aggressive copying. While Western lawyers were flooding the courts with copyright infringement lawsuits, in Guangdong province, thousands of small workshops were taking foreign technology apart down to the last screw. They were engaged in reverse engineering, but they weren't just copying, they were adapting products to the needs of developing countries. Phones with batteries that lasted a month appeared, along with devices featuring TV antennas and ultra-loud speakers. It was a wild but incredibly effective school of entrepreneurship. It was from this pirate environment that the legal tech giants later emerged, the very ones that today dictate trends to the entire world. December 2001 marked the culmination of this chapter. After 15 years of grueling negotiations, China officially joined the World Trade Organization, WTO. The Western elite celebrated the victory. US President Bill Clinton declared that China's integration into the global market would make it open, liberal, and dependent on the West. This was the greatest geopolitical mistake of the century. China did not change its system. It used WTO rules to completely wipe out its competitors' industries. The reduction in tariffs led to Chinese goods becoming cheaper than the raw materials used to produce them in the US or Europe. In America, the domestic auto industry and textile factories began closing rapidly, turning entire states into the depressed Rust Belt. China gained the status of an untouchable economic titan. By joining the WTO, China has accumulated unprecedented gold and foreign exchange reserves in 10 years. Trillions of dollars poured into the country. And the party faced a new challenge. What to do with this money? Should we leave them lying in American bonds or make them work inside the country? Beijing chose the second path, launching the craziest construction experiment in human history. Do you know which statistic best describes modern China? Between 2011 and 2013, China produced and poured more concrete than the United States did during the entire 20th century. Think about that. All of America's skyscrapers, highways, the Hoover Dam, and the Golden Gate Bridge pale in comparison to what the Chinese built in just 36 months. When trillions of dollars flooded into the country after joining the WTO and the global financial crisis struck in 2008, the party made a historic decision. To keep the economy from grinding to a halt, they poured colossal sums of money into infrastructure. China turned into the largest construction site in human history. It was an era when mountains were leveled to make way for new airports and oceans were spanned by bridges. But why did the Communist Party feel the need to flood the country with concrete? And how did this lead to the emergence of those eerie ghost towns? An American proverb goes, "The US became rich because it built roads, not because roads appeared because it became rich." China has taken this principle to the extreme. For the world's factory to run smoothly, it needed a flawless circulatory system. In a single decade, they covered the country with a network of expressways that surpassed the American one in length. They built the 55-kilometer Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau bridge right across the bay. They automated the ports so that now, in Shanghai and Shenzhen, robotic cranes load thousands of containers around the clock without human intervention. Why such expenses? It's simple. When goods travel from the factory to the ship in 2 hours on a perfect road, their cost of production drops. Logistics has become China's main competitive advantage, eliminating any chance other countries have of producing goods cheaply. But high-speed railways have become the true symbol of China's infrastructure miracle. In 2008, ahead of the Beijing Olympics, China launched its first such line. At that time, they had 0 kilometers of their own tracks. Today, their network exceeds 42,000 kilometers. That's more than in all other countries in the world combined. You can board a gleaming white express train in snowy Beijing and reach tropical Guangzhou at 350 kilometers per hour, faster than by plane, factoring in check-in time. These trains have literally compressed this vast country. People were able to live in cheaper provinces and commute to work in the megacities. This united scattered regions into a single monolithic economic mechanism. Foreign engineers said it was impossible to lay tracks through the mountains of Tibet and the swamps of the south. The Chinese simply smiled and dug thousands of tunnels. But every craze has a dark side. The government became so hooked on concrete that construction became an end in itself. Local officials were rewarded with promotions for boosting GDP in their regions. And what drives the fastest GDP growth? That's right, construction. That's how China began to see the emergence of eerie ghost towns. The most famous of them is Ordos in Inner Mongolia, a metropolis designed for 1 million people with perfect roads, parks, stadiums and gigantic shopping malls, in which no one lived. The Chinese even built their own copy of Paris with the Eiffel Tower. the city of Tianducheng, whose streets have been deserted for years. Developers were building entire neighborhoods from nowhere to nowhere. Why? Because real estate had become the only understandable investment option for ordinary Chinese people. People were buying apartments by the dozen while they were still just foundations, with no intention of living in them. They believed that concrete would only ever go up in value. This never-ending concrete bonanza was funded by loans. Developers borrowed billions, broke ground on projects, collected money from the public for apartments that hadn't even been built yet, and used that money to start new construction projects. It was a classic pyramid scheme on a colossal scale, and this bubble was bound to burst. The trigger was the collapse of the construction giant Evergrande. The company, with $300 billion in debt, more than the external debt of some countries, found itself on the brink of bankruptcy. The government finally hit the brakes, declaring homes are meant to be lived in, not for speculation. For the first time in decades, millions of Chinese realized that their savings, invested in eternal concrete, could turn to dust. A wave of demolitions swept across the country. Brand new but unfinished skyscrapers were blown up by the block because it was cheaper to destroy them than to finish building them. The infrastructure boom achieved its goal. It gave China the world's best logistics system, created millions of jobs, and kept GDP afloat during the most turbulent years. But Beijing realized that it couldn't keep pouring concrete into the economy indefinitely. The old growth model had run its course. China needed a new driver, one that was invisible, omnipresent, and controlling. The party decided to shift its ambitions from the physical world to the digital one. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the cyberpunk world that has already arrived. We'll learn how China skipped the era of bank cards, how a single app, WeChat, replaced people's passports and wallets, and how artificial intelligence became the primary tool for total control over 1 billion people. While the Western world spent decades getting used to bank cards, chips, and contactless payments, China did what economists call leapfrogging. They simply skipped an entire technological era. In the early 2000s, cash was a huge problem in China. It was dirty, often counterfeited, and transporting bags of cash between cities was dangerous and expensive. Then technology offered an elegant solution, a black and white square. In just a couple of years, a country with a population of over 1 billion people completely abandoned wallets in favor of QR codes. The phenomenon has reached its peak. Today in China, even street musicians and homeless people begging for alms hold up a piece of cardboard with a printed QR code. This isn't just a matter of convenience, it's the foundation upon which the party has built the most extensive and sophisticated system of digital control in human history. At the heart of this digital utopia lies a single app, WeChat. For Europeans or Americans, a messaging app is simply a place to chat with friends.